Imagine boarding a plane for a simple rugby trip and disappearing into the Andes for 72 days. In October 1972, a group from Uruguay was flying to Chile. Most of them were young rugby players, friends and relatives. None of them knew this normal journey would become one of the most shocking survival stories ever told. They were not soldiers, they were not trained explorers. They were students, athletes, brothers, sons and friends from the old Christians rugby team. They were joking, carrying bags, and thinking about the match ahead. But in only a few hours, their lives would depend on decisions no human should ever have to make. The aircraft was a Fairchild FH227D, operated by the Uruguayan Air Force. It had 45 people on board. The flight was supposed to cross the Andes and reach Santiago, Chile. But the weather over the mountains was dangerous, and one navigation mistake would change everything. Inside the cabin, passengers looked out at clouds and white peaks. Some were relaxed. Others started to feel nervous as the plane moved closer to the mountains. The Andes are not normal mountains. They are huge, cold, and deadly. If something went wrong there, help would not arrive quickly. The plane entered the mountain range surrounded by clouds. From above, the Andes looked endless. Peaks rose like walls on every side. The pilots believed they were closer to Chile than they actually were. That mistake put the aircraft on a deadly path. In the cockpit, the pilots began descending too early. They thought they had already crossed the highest part of the mountains. But they were still deep inside the Andes. Through the clouds, the ground was rising fast. The plane was running out of space. Suddenly, a dark mountain ridge appeared directly ahead. The pilots tried to climb, but it was too late. The aircraft struck the mountain. Its tail and wings broke away, and the front part of the fuselage slid down the snow like a metal sled. Inside the cabin, everything turned into chaos in seconds. Luggage flew forward. Seats tore loose. People screamed as the aircraft broke apart. Then, after the terrible impact and the long slide, there was silence. The survivors opened their eyes in a place that looked like another planet. The plane had crashed high in the Andes, almost 4,000 meters above sea level. Around them there was nothing but snow, rock and mountains. No road, no village, no trees, no easy way down. The broken fuselage was now their only shelter. The survivors searched the wreckage for anything useful. They found a little food, some wine, clothes and luggage. But they had no proper winter gear, no real medical supplies and no way to call for help. The cold was already becoming one of their greatest enemies. At first, everyone believed rescuers would arrive soon. They helped the injured, gathered supplies, and tried to stay calm. But many were hurt, and the altitude made every movement exhausting. The first hours were not only about survival. They were about refusing to panic. Then they looked around and understood the truth. They were surrounded by mountains in every direction. The white snow made it almost impossible for search planes to spot the wreck. Even if rescuers flew nearby, the survivors could be invisible from the sky. The first night was brutal. Temperatures dropped far below freezing. The survivors squeezed into the broken fuselage, using it as a shield against the wind. Outside, the mountains were silent. Inside, people tried to sleep while wondering who would still be alive by morning. They used seat cushions, bags, and pieces of clothing to cover themselves. The fuselage became a tiny metal cave. There was almost no room to move. Every breath felt cold. Every sound outside made them wonder if the mountain itself was coming for them. The open end of the aircraft let freezing wind blow straight inside, so they blocked it with luggage, seats, and pieces of metal. It was not comfortable, but it helped. In the Andes, small improvements mattered. A little less wind could mean another night alive. Water was everywhere, but only as snow. They had to melt it slowly, using sunlight, metal pieces, and whatever containers they could find. Drinking snow directly could make them colder. Even getting water became a daily battle that took time, patience, and energy. Their food supply was almost nothing for so many people. A few chocolates, some snacks, and bottles of wine had to be divided into tiny portions. They tried to make it last, but it was obvious. The food would run out long before rescue came. They found a small radio and listened desperately for news. For days, they hoped to hear that search teams were getting closer. But then, about 10 days after the crash, they heard the worst possible message. The official search had been suspended. Search planes had flown over the mountains, but the white wreck disappeared into the snow. From above, the survivors were almost impossible to see. They waved, shouted, and waited. But each time the sound of aircraft faded away, hope faded with it. When they heard the search was called off, the mood inside the fuselage changed. They were no longer just waiting to be found. They had to face a harder truth. If they stayed passive, they would die there. Survival now depended on them. Storms made everything worse. Snow buried the wreck, blocked visibility, and trapped them inside. The wind sounded like it wanted to tear the fuselage apart. They were not just lost, they were living inside a frozen trap that changed every day. Then, on the 17th day, disaster struck again. An avalanche crashed down onto the fuselage and buried the survivors under snow. 8 more people died. Those who remained had to dig themselves out from inside their own shelter. The survivors used broken pieces of the plane as tools. They dug through packed snow, exhausted and terrified. The avalanche proved something frightening. Even the place that protected them could become deadly in seconds. The mountain gave them no rest. After the avalanche, the fuselage felt even more like a tomb. Snow pressed against the windows, air was limited, light was limited, hope was limited. But somehow the survivors kept organizing, counting supplies, making plans, and forcing themselves to continue. Soon there was no normal food left. This became the most difficult and painful part of the story. To stay alive, the survivors made a decision that shocked the world. They used the bodies of friends who had already died as their last source of food. They did not make that decision lightly. They prayed, they argued, they cried. For them, it was not about horror. It was about survival, sacrifice, and the promise that if one of them lived, the story of the others would not be forgotten. To survive, they became a team again. Some cared for the injured, some worked on water, some repaired shelter, some planned routes. They scratched days into metal and tried to keep order. In a place designed to break people, discipline kept them alive. They even built tools from the wreck. They made snow goggles to protect their eyes from the blinding white light. They used aircraft fabric, seat covers, and insulation. Nothing was wasted. Every broken piece of the plane became part of their survival system. Several small expeditions tried to find a way out, but the mountains were too steep, too cold, and too confusing. Each attempt taught them one thing: no one was coming. Someone would have to cross the Andes on foot. Walking at that altitude was torture. Every step sank into snow. The air was thin. The sun burned their faces during the day, and the cold attacked them at night. Without proper equipment, even a short trip felt impossible. One expedition found the tail section of the plane. Inside, they discovered batteries, luggage, and a few supplies. For a moment, hope returned. Maybe they could use the batteries to power the radio. Maybe they could finally send a signal. They worked with wires, radio parts, and batteries, trying to bring the dead aircraft back to life. But the plan failed. The radio could not save them. After all that effort, the answer was clear again. The only way out was across the mountain. By December, only 16 survivors remained. 3 men were chosen for the final expedition: Nando Parrado, Roberto Canesov, and Antonio Vicentin. They prepared homemade packs and an improvised sleeping bag. The others watched them leave, knowing this might be their last chance. The climb was brutal. For 3 days they pushed upward through snow and ice. Every step demanded energy they barely had. They believed that once they reached the top, they might see green valleys and civilization. But the Andes had one more cruel surprise. When Parrado and Canessa reached the ridge, they saw mountains stretching endlessly in every direction. They were not close to Chilean towns. They were still trapped deep inside the range. For a moment, it must have felt like the world had no way out. Antonio Vicentin returned to the crash site so the other 2 could continue with more food. Parrado and Canessa kept walking. Their clothes were weak, their bodies were weak. But turning back meant everyone at the plane would eventually die. At night, they slept in the improvised sleeping bag, exposed to freezing wind. There was no tent, no fire, and no real protection. If the sleeping bag failed, they could freeze before morning. Each sunrise was a victory. After days of walking, the snow began to change. Rocks appeared, then patches of earth, then water. The mountains were still around them, but the landscape looked different. For the first time in weeks, they saw signs that life might exist beyond the snow. They followed a river through the lower valley, exhausted and barely able to continue. Their bodies had been pushed past normal limits. They had survived the crash, starvation, storms, avalanche, and the mountains. Now they needed one final miracle, another human being. On December 20th, they saw a man across a river. His name was Sergio Catalan, a Chilean muleteer. Because of the noise of the water, they could not speak clearly. So they used a note tied to a stone to explain who they were. The message said they had come from a plane that crashed in the mountains. It said 14 others were still at the aircraft, injured, starving, and unable to leave. That small note became the bridge between death and rescue. Sergio Catalan rode for hours to alert the authorities. The story sounded unbelievable. Survivors from a plane crash, alive after more than 2 months in the Andes. But it was true. The rescue operation that had once ended was suddenly alive again. Chilean rescue teams prepared helicopters for a dangerous mission. The crash site was high, remote, and difficult to reach. The weather could change fast. But now they had something they did not have before, exact proof that people were still alive. Back at the wreck, the survivors heard a sound they had dreamed about for 72 days. A helicopter. This time it was not passing far away. It was coming for them. Men ran out into the snow, looking up in disbelief. The helicopter landed near the broken fuselage, blasting snow into the air. After weeks of silence, the mountain was suddenly full of noise, movement, and rescue workers. The survivors who had waited so long finally knew they were going home. One by one, the men were helped into the helicopter. They were weak, thin, and exhausted, but alive. Some had survived because others cared for them. Some had survived because 2 friends walked out of the mountains. All of them carried the memory of those who did not return. From the helicopter windows, the Andes looked different. The same mountains that had trapped them now fell away beneath them. For 72 days, those peaks had been a prison. Now they were the landscape of an impossible escape. When the survivors reached safety, families who had believed they were dead saw them alive again. The world was stunned. The story was painful, controversial, and emotional. But it was also a story of teamwork, loyalty, and the will to survive. After the rescue, the wreck remained in the mountains, empty, silent, frozen. It had been an aeroplane, then a shelter, then a prison, then the place where 16 people held on to life long enough for help to come. The Andes disaster is remembered not only because people survived, but because they survived together. They faced cold, hunger, fear, and impossible choices. And after 72 days, 16 people came home. What do you think kept them alive? Hope, teamwork, or the fear of giving up?